Snow whispered through the air, blanketing the small town in a hushed stillness that only December could conjure. In the corner of this sleepy place stood Oliver's quaint shop, its once vibrant window displays dimmed by neglect. Inside, the shopkeeper himself slumped behind the counter, his weary eyes fixed on the faint glow of Christmas lights strung across the square. Once, he had loved the season. Now, it was merely a time of bills and dwindling customers. As the clock struck midnight, Oliver prepared to lock up for the night. Just as he reached the door, a peculiar flash of red caught his eye. His breath misted in the frosty air as he leaned down to retrieve an envelope, crimson with a golden seal, lying impossibly pristine in the untouched snow. Curiosity outweighed caution, and Oliver cracked the seal, revealing a note written in swirling, luminous script that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. To Oliver Hastings, the magic of Christmas calls. Answer the invitation, and your world shall change. Midnight awaits. He frowned. A joke, surely. One of the neighborhood children trying to be clever. Yet as his fingers traced the elegant letters, a strange warmth spread through his hands, dispelling the biting chill of the night. Against his better judgment, Oliver tucked the envelope into his coat and locked the shop. That night, as the snow fell heavier, Oliver found sleep elusive. He sat by his single candle, the letter placed on the table before him, its words echoing in his mind. Midnight approached, and just as the clock began its chime, a peculiar drowsiness overtook him. His eyelids grew heavy, and before he could rise to blow out the candle, the world tilted. When he awoke, it was not to the creak of his warm bed or the grey walls of his apartment. Instead, he found himself enveloped by the soft golden glow of a vast chamber filled with bustling figures. Oliver sat up, his breath hitching as his eyes adjusted to the sight of tiny sharp-eared creatures darting to and fro, their hands busy crafting toys of every shape and size. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine, and faint tinkling music filled the space. "Ah, you're awake!" came a sharp voice, and Oliver turned to see a wiry elf standing before him, his spectacles perched precariously on the tip of his nose. The elf looked him up and down with a mixture of annoyance and bemusement. "Not exactly what I expected, but the magic rarely errs." Oliver blinked. Where am I?" he stammered, his voice hoarse. "You're at the North Pole, of course," the elf said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Now do try to keep up. We've got a schedule to maintain, and you're frightfully behind already." "Behind on what?" Oliver demanded, rising shakily to his feet. The elf sighed dramatically and gestured toward a towering mirror that seemed to materialize out of thin air. Oliver's breath caught as he saw his reflection, or rather, what should have been his reflection. Instead of his usual disheveled appearance, he saw a figure clad in crimson robes, trimmed with white fur, a golden belt around his waist, and a hat perched jauntily on his head. "I'm Santa Claus," the elf finished with a smirk. "For now, anyway. You accepted the invitation, didn't you? Consider this a temporary assignment." Oliver's head spun as he stumbled back from the mirror, his hands trembling. "This has to be a dream," he whispered. The elf clapped his hands sharply. "Dream or not, you've got a sleigh to prepare and a list to review. Come along, Mr. Hastings. Or should I say, Mr. Claus?" As Oliver reluctantly followed the bustling elf, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone else had received a very different letter. Far away, in a modest apartment in the heart of the city, a man dressed in the unmistakable crimson robes of St. Nicholas stood in stunned silence. Santa Claus himself was now surrounded by the hum of modern life. The flickering television, the distant honk of car horns, and the faint aroma of instant coffee. His hand held a plain envelope, addressed simply to the man in the red suit. "Curious," Santa murmured, his eyes twinkling despite his confusion. The swap had begun. Oliver trudged after the head elf, his steps faltering as he took in the scene around him. The workshop was a world unto itself, an endless expanse of glowing light and intricate machinery, where elves hummed and whirred as busily as the contraptions they operated. Shelves stretched into infinity, stacked with toys and trinkets of every kind, and ladders floated seamlessly from one level to the next. "I can't do this," Oliver muttered under his breath. But the head elf, sharp-eared and sharper-tongued, heard him. "Can't is for mortals without magic, and tonight you have all the magic you need." The elf adjusted his spectacles and waved at a hovering clipboard that zipped into his hand. "Now focus. The first rule of Santa is simple. Believe. Believe in the magic. Believe in the sleigh. And most importantly," the elf paused, his eyes glinting behind the lenses, "believe in yourself." Oliver opened his mouth to protest, but the words withered under the weight of the elf's gaze. Instead, he nodded mutely and followed as the little figure led him deeper into the labyrinth of the workshop. Meanwhile, far from the twinkling glow of the North Pole, Santa was discovering the chaos of the modern world. He stood in the middle of Oliver's apartment, his gaze sweeping the cluttered space. Stacks of unopened bills rested precariously on the small dining table, next to a calendar marked with more missed dates than circled ones. A tiny Christmas tree stood forlorn in the corner, its single strand of lights blinking feebly. Santa stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Curious," he murmured, stepping toward the table and picking up one of the envelopes. The words "Final Notice" leaped out at him, their sharp angles stark against the paper. Before he could examine it further, a sudden noise startled him. a loud, insistent buzzing from a strange device on the counter. Santa approached cautiously, eyeing the glowing screen. The device vibrated again, and a voice crackled through the air. "Oliver, it's me. Are you ignoring me? Rent's due tomorrow, and I'm not covering for you this time. Call me back." The message ended with a sharp beep, leaving Santa to frown at the curious contraption. He tapped it experimentally, and to his surprise, it sprang to life with more glowing symbols. "A fascinating device," Santa mused, setting it down as he turned his attention to the window. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Cars honked, voices called out, and strings of lights flickered like stars between buildings. Yet, amidst the bustle, Santa could sense a weariness, a disconnection. It was as if the people here had forgotten the very spirit of the season he worked so hard to protect. As the hours passed, Santa immersed himself in Oliver's world. He discovered the small shop beneath the apartment, its shelves sparsely stocked and its till nearly empty. He watched the faces of the few customers who entered, noting their hurried steps and distracted expressions. "This man carries a heavy burden," Santa murmured to himself. He glanced down at his own reflection in the frosty glass of the shop window, his red coat stark against the dim interior. For the first time, he felt the weight of being human, not just in the physical sense, but in the way every choice seemed to carry consequences that lingered far beyond their moment. Back at the North Pole, Oliver was having revelations of his own. The sleigh loomed before him, its polished surface gleaming like a pool of molten silver. Reindeer stamped their hooves impatiently, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Oliver hesitated, his hands trembling as he approached. "Go on," the head elf urged, his tone softer now. "Touch the reins." Oliver reached out, half expecting the sleigh to vanish like a mirage. Instead, a warm current surged through him the moment his fingers brushed the leather. Images flashed in his mind: children's laughter, snowflakes falling in quiet forests, the glow of a fire on Christmas Eve. He gasped, pulling back as the visions faded. "What was that?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "The essence of Christmas," the elf replied simply. "You see, Oliver, Santa doesn't just deliver gifts. He delivers hope, wonder, and joy to a world that desperately needs it. You have a chance to do the same, if you're brave enough to try." Oliver stared at the sleigh, his doubts warring with the flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, the faintest spark of belief. As the first star appeared in the darkened sky, the lives of two very different men continued to intertwine, each discovering that the magic of Christmas wasn't confined to one role or one place. It was a force waiting to be rekindled in every heart. At the North Pole, the sleigh was finally prepared. The reindeer stood in a perfect line, their breaths creating clouds of frost that mingled with the shimmering auroras above. Oliver, now clad fully in Santa's resplendent robes, adjusted his gloves nervously, The reins felt impossibly heavy in his hands, though he hadn't yet lifted them. The head elf, who had introduced himself as Peregrine, hovered at his side, muttering instructions as though sensing Oliver's every doubt. "Remember, the sleigh won't obey hesitation. Confidence is the key, Mr. Hastings, or Mr. Claus, as you must think of yourself now." Peregrine's sharp eyes softened for a moment. "The magic knows when your heart is true." "Confidence," Oliver repeated under his breath, as though saying the word might conjure it. But confidence eluded him, and as he hesitated, the nearest reindeer, an excitable young buck named Comet, snorted and broke free of the line. Chaos erupted. Comet bounded through the workshop, his powerful hooves clattering against the polished floors. Elves scattered like a burst of leaves in the wind, their high-pitched cries echoing through the vast space. Oliver froze, his mind racing as the scene spiraled out of control. "Do something!" Peregrine hissed, yanking at Oliver's sleeve. "I don't know what to do!" Oliver snapped. But even as he said it, a strange warmth spread through his chest. It was the same sensation he'd felt when he first touched the reins. A rush of images that whispered of joy, laughter, and wonder. The realization hit him like a bell's chime. The magic was waiting for him to take hold. With a deep breath, Oliver stepped forward, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "Comet!" he called. The reindeer paused mid-leap, turning its antlered head toward Oliver, who now extended a hand. "Come here." For a heartbeat, the workshop fell silent, the elves holding their breath. Then, with a soft huff, Comet trotted toward Oliver, nudging his gloved hand with an almost apologetic snort. A ripple of cheers broke out among the elves, and Peregrine adjusted his spectacles, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said at last, "perhaps there's hope for you yet." Meanwhile, back in the city, Santa faced a trial of a different sort. The shop bell jingled softly as a new customer entered. A young boy bundled in a threadbare coat, his cheeks flushed red from the cold. He wandered through the aisles with wide eyes, stopping at a shelf of wooden toys. His small hands hovered over a painted train set, but he pulled back as though the mere touch might be forbidden. Santa, who had been sweeping the floor, a task he found oddly meditative, paused and watched the boy. There was something familiar in the child's gaze, a yearning that reminded him of the letters he received each year. "Do you like trains?" Santa asked gently, setting the broom aside. The boy startled, then nodded shyly. "My dad says we can't afford one," he murmured. Santa crouched to meet the boy's eyes, a twinkle returning to his own. "Sometimes the best gifts aren't bought," he said. Reaching behind the counter, he found a forgotten wooden train, its paint chipped but its charm intact. "How about this one? It's a little worn, but I think it still has plenty of adventures left in it." The boy's face lit up, and for a moment, Santa felt the same rush of magic he did every Christmas Eve. Later, as the boy skipped out of the shop clutching his new treasure, Santa glanced at the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. A flicker of doubt crept into his thoughts. In his world, gifts were given without concern for money. Here, the act of giving seemed bound by limitations that felt foreign to him. As night fell, Santa wandered the city, his coat catching the light of the festive decorations that lined the streets. He saw families gathering in warm homes, their laughter spilling into the cold air. Yet, he also saw shadows, lonely figures trudging through the snow, faces lined with weariness. "It's not enough to bring joy," Santa murmured to himself. "I must understand their struggles too." In the North Pole, Oliver climbed into the sleigh for the first time. The reins felt different now, lighter in his hands. As the reindeer shifted restlessly, Peregrine handed him a glowing scroll, its golden text pulsing faintly. "What's this?" Oliver asked. "Your list," Peregrine replied, his tone grave. "It's not just names, it's wishes, dreams, and the hopes of everyone who still believes." Oliver unrolled the scroll, and his breath caught as names spilled across the parchment like starlight. For the first time, he felt the enormity of the task before him, but also its wonder. As the sleigh lifted into the night, the moonlight catching on its silver runners, both men, Santa and Oliver, began to see that their trials were shaping them in ways neither could have foreseen. The sleigh soared through the velvet night, its runners gliding on a current of unseen magic. Oliver gripped the reins tightly, his knuckles white against the dark leather. Below him, the world stretched out in a patchwork of glittering lights and snow-draped rooftops. The reindeer flew with an effortless grace, their antlers gleaming like frost-kissed branches. "Remember," Peregrine's voice echoed in his mind, though the elf was far below. "It's not just the gifts, it's the belief you carry with you. That's the true magic of Santa Claus." Oliver glanced at the glowing scroll beside him. The name seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Each line whispered a dream, a hope, a wish made in the quiet moments of wonder that even the hardest hearts couldn't entirely suppress. The sleigh slowed as they approached their first stop, a small village nestled in a snow-covered valley. The rooftops shimmered in the moonlight, and the chimneys exhaled gentle wisps of smoke. Oliver hesitated, the enormity of his task weighing heavily on him. "It's not about perfection," he muttered to himself, recalling Peregrine's advice. "It's about heart." With that, he descended the sleigh and began his work. Far from the quiet village, in the bustling heart of the city, Santa faced a different challenge. The shop's lights burned late into the night, drawing curious passers-by with its warm glow. Word had spread of a mysterious man in red who offered small miracles. Unpaid toys, a kind word, a helping hand. Among the visitors was an elderly widow named Mrs. Ellison. She entered the shop with a tentative step, her weathered hands clutching a small parcel wrapped in faded paper. "I heard you were helping folks," she said, her voice soft but lined with years of resilience. Santa smiled warmly and motioned for her to sit. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Ellison?" The woman blinked in surprise. "How did you know my name?" "I make it my business to know such things," Santa replied enigmatically, his eyes twinkling. "Now, tell me." She unwrapped the parcel, revealing a delicate porcelain angel, its wings chipped, but its beauty undiminished. "This belonged to my daughter," she said. "She passed many years ago, but this angel has always reminded me of her." Santa studied the figure, his gloved hands turning it gently. "And now, the wings are breaking," she said, her voice catching. "I thought perhaps it could be fixed." Santa placed the angel on the counter and nodded. "Leave it with me." Mrs. Ellison's eyes filled with gratitude. "You don't know what this means to me." "I know more than you think," Santa murmured as she left, the shop bell jingling softly behind her. As the door closed, Santa turned back to the angel. With a deep breath, he placed his hands over it, feeling the faint hum of magic still alive in the world. It was weaker here, dulled by time and disbelief, but it wasn't gone. Slowly the angel's wings began to mend, the fractures glowing faintly before fading into smooth porcelain. By dawn, the angel stood whole once more, a silent testament to the power of care and intention. Oliver, too, was discovering the quiet magic of his role. At one stop, he found a single stocking hung by a fireplace, its threads worn and its contents sparse. He reached into his sack, pulling out a small wooden train painted in bright red and green. As he placed it carefully in the stocking, he paused. On the mantel above, a faded photograph showed a boy sitting beside a Christmas tree, his eyes filled with wonder. Oliver smiled faintly, imagining the boy waking to find a gift that, while small, might rekindle that same spark of joy. He moved from house to house, his hesitations fading with each step. The sleigh seemed to respond to his growing confidence, its flight smoother and faster. By the time dawn began to break on the horizon, Oliver felt something he hadn't in years. A quiet, steady pride in his actions. As the first rays of sunlight kissed the snowy rooftops, both men felt a shift within themselves. Oliver, weary but content, returned to the North Pole to find Peregrine waiting. "Well?" the elf asked, his sharp features softened by an unusual smile. Oliver handed him the scroll, now faintly glowing with a golden warmth. "I think I understand now," he said simply. Far away, Santa watched from the window of the shop as the city stirred to life. He saw Mrs. Ellison pass by, her parcel clutched tightly in her arms, her face radiant with quiet joy. He turned to the now quiet shop, its shelves lighter but its spirit brighter, and smiled. Each man, in his own way, had learned that giving wasn't about grandeur or perfection. It was about connection, about touching lives in ways both small and profound. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of gold and rose, casting a tranquil light over both the North Pole and the bustling city. In the North Pole's vast workshop, Oliver stepped down from the sleigh for the final time. His breath billowed in the cold air, but his heart was warm, ignited by an experience he could hardly put into words. Peregrine stood waiting, his hands clasped behind his back. For once, the head elf's sharp tongue was stilled, his expression contemplative as he looked at Oliver. "Well, Mr. Hastings," Peregrine said, his voice quieter than usual. "You've completed the rounds. How does it feel to walk in another man's boots?" Oliver hesitated, his gloved hands resting on the edge of the sleigh. "I thought it was about the gifts," he admitted. "About the magic in the sleigh. But it's more than that, isn't it? It's about giving people something they can't find on their own. Hope, joy, a little wonder." The elf's sharp features softened into the faintest of smiles. "You've learned well," Peregrine said. "The role isn't just a mantle, it's a responsibility, one that reaches far beyond toys and ribbons." Oliver nodded, his gaze drifting to the sleigh. "And yet, it's not my responsibility. Not really." Peregrine adjusted his spectacles. "No," he said softly, "but you've carried it well, and now it's time to return what was never truly yours." Before Oliver could reply, the air around him shimmered and the world tilted once again. Far away in the small shop nestled in the city's heart, Santa Claus stood at the counter, his gloved hands brushing the polished wood. The bell above the door jingled softly as a woman entered. Mrs. Ellison, her face aglow with quiet joy. She clutched the mended porcelain angel to her chest as though it were the most precious treasure in the world. "You've brought back something I thought I'd lost forever," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you." Santa inclined his head, his eyes twinkling. "It wasn't gone," he replied gently, "just waiting to be found again." As Mrs. Ellison left the shop, Santa turned to the window, his gaze sweeping the street below. He had walked in another man's shoes, seen the burdens and joys of a world far removed from his own. He understood now that the magic of Christmas wasn't confined to chimneys and stockings. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life, hidden in moments of connection and kindness. The first light of dawn crept into the shop, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. As the city stirred awake, Santa felt the air shift, the faint hum of magic rippling through the quiet. When Oliver opened his eyes, he found himself in his apartment once more. The hum of the city filtered through the window, mingling with the faint jingling of distant bells. He sat up, his hand brushing the edge of his bed, half expecting to see Peregrine scowling at him. Instead, he found the familiar clutter of his small home. But something was different. The air felt lighter, the space warmer, as though some intangible glow had been left behind. On the table lay the crimson envelope, its golden seal now broken. Beneath it, a single note had been scrawled in elegant script. "Thank you, Oliver. For a moment, you reminded the world what it means to believe." Oliver stared at the note, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He rose, glancing toward the tiny Christmas tree in the corner of the room. Its single strand of lights blinked faintly, casting a soft glow that seemed brighter than he remembered. At the North Pole, Santa returned to his sleigh, his gloved hands tracing its familiar contours. Peregrine appeared at his side, his expression unreadable. "Did you find what you were looking for?" the elf asked. Santa chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with the weight of newfound understanding. "Perhaps it wasn't about finding," he replied. "Perhaps it was about remembering." As the sleigh lifted into the crisp morning air, the bells jingling a song of renewal, both men carried the lessons of their journeys close to their hearts. Oliver returned to his shop with a renewed sense of purpose, while Santa resumed his duties with a deeper connection to the world he served. And though neither spoke of the swap, each left a mark on the other's life, a reminder that the spirit of Christmas isn't bound by roles or places. It is carried in every act of kindness, every spark of belief, and every heart willing to give.